We now come to the debate on the All-Party Cycling Group report. Get Britain cycling. Dr. Julian Huppert.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a great pleasure to move this motion. I thank the Backbench Business Committee for agreeing to schedule a debate on this subject. After the success of our very well-attended debate last year in Westminster Hall, which showed just how many members of this House care about cycling. And we discussed there are all forms of cycling, from sport to commuting, leisure, utility, all-access cycling. And it was clear from that debate the members agreed that cycling was an energy-efficient form of transport, a healthy way to get around, a cheap means of travelling and fun as well. And no one who was at that debate will forget the tale we had of romance on a tandem. And since that debate, the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling Group, which I have the great pleasure of co-chairing together with the Honourable Member for Dudley North, has conducted a detailed inquiry to make a series of recommendations for what government ought to do to get Britain cycling. And it is that report that we are debating today. And to produce that, we spoke to a wide range of people from the cycling... Absolutely.
I'm very grateful. I'm not at all surprised that this debate is so well attended. And I just want to put on record the representations I've received from at least one constituent who wants us to focus still more on cycling as part of an improved environment. And would the honourable gentleman therefore agree with me that improving the road structure, pathways and so on is important because individuals want to take part, but also because it's a great attraction for the tourism opportunities that our areas represent.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments, and I agree completely. There are huge benefits. I will outline some of them in my speech now, but he is absolutely right that tourism can benefit, the environmental concerns. There are lots and lots of benefits of getting Britain cycling. I will do, and then I'd like to make some...
Very briefly. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to stress the benefits, but would he also accept, as I hope most people would in this House, that there are also tragedies associated? One thinks of Mary Bowers, who is still in a coma, and one thinks of the excellent campaign run by the Times, Cities Fit for Cycling. Would he accept that cycling is not only a marvellous, fit and healthy way to travel, but it's also one that should be protected, and cyclists should be safe?
I agree, of course, with the Honourable Gentleman, and there have been a number of tragedies. Part of what we ought to do is to make sure that it is safe for people to cycle. It's actually fairly safe at the moment, but the perception is a problem, and there are far too many tragic incidents, such as Mary Bowers. I agree. If I can make a bit more progress, and then I will...
let them sit through the
we spoke to a wide range of people, from cycling organisations themselves, who I thank for their assistance throughout the process, but also a range such as the police, the freight industry, Living Streets, the President of the Automobile Association and many others. And I thank all of them, and particularly those parliamentarians from both houses who served on the panel, many of whom are here today, and also Adam Kaufman, who coordinated the entire process. Now, there were hundreds of suggestions for recommendations, and you can find those and more analysis in the companion report from Professor Phil Goodwin, together with transcripts of the entire sessions if you wish to follow them. Currently, only about 2% of trips are done by bike in this country, a tiny fraction, well below the levels found in many countries. A huge range of short trips that could easily be walked or cycled are driven. And that is why we set a long-term ambition to try to increase from 2% to 10% by 2025 and 25% by 2050. That's entirely doable and is still below what, for example, the Dutch managed to achieve. And I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way so generously again, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as he highlights, very few people cycle, but in my borough of Hackney, we actually have a far higher percentage, higher even than 10% of people regularly commute to cycling. Would he not agree this is testament to what can be done with forward-thinking, good planning and a political will to achieve a change?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comment and for her work on this report. And she's absolutely right, there are exemplars. My own constituency in Cambridge, we have about a third of trips now done by bike. We're hoping to expand that with the money that's been given by the government for the ambition grant to 40%. Places are showing that they can do this. The rest of the country can as well.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way once on this side, and then I'll make a bit more progress. And then
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's absolutely right. Of course, the government must provide funding, and it has been doing so. But it's also important for local authorities, I think, to be doing more. Can I just quote briefly what the chairman, Adrian Lawson, of the Reading Cycling Campaign said, and he's a constituent. He said this about Reading Borough Council: "We identified a lot of simple things that would make it immeasurably better for cyclists. This was over a year ago. Not a single thing has happened." It just goes to show, does he not agree with me, that we need local councils also to implement?
Yeah. Absolutely. Local authorities have a critical role to play. But if more people were to cycle and to walk, we would all benefit. We would be healthier, saving huge amounts of money for the NHS, billions of pounds. There'd be less congestion on the roads, making travel times faster and more reliable for those who are in cars. There'd be less pressure on city centre parking, helping people to get to the shops, keep the economy going, and the economy would grow. In fact, cycling already contributes around £3 billion to the UK economy, but is not always seen as significant as that. We all win by promoting cycling and promoting walking. Yes.
Could I applaud the securing of this debate by the honourable gentleman and those members who have their name to the motion today. And could I say as well, this can be done not only in Cambridge, but also in extremely hilly and mountainous areas such as the constituency of Ogmore, with the right investment by the local authority and the voluntary sector in things like safe routes to school, which then link up to safe routes to work, which then link up to the Avon Argyll mountain bike track as well. It can be done.
It can indeed be done. It doesn't have to be a flat, dry area like Cambridge. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. It can be done anywhere in the country. I will, and then I want to make some progress.
I thank him for his generosity in giving way. I'd like to draw attention to Ealing, which has a very strong reputation as a cycling borough, and schools there are playing their part in training young people using their travel plans. 8 schools in Ealing are now have travel plans that are considered outstanding, and I wonder whether my honourable friend would agree that using travel plans is a very imaginative way for schools to train youngsters in cycling.
Travel plans do play a critical role, and she's absolutely right to highlight the role of schools, because training in schools makes a big difference. The government has protected bikeability funding. I had my own bikeability training during the summer from Outspoken Training in Cambridge, and I learned quite a lot from that, and it would be good to see other people having that. I will take one more from this side, one more from that side, then I'm just going to speak.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend who has, I think, the distinction of being fashionable now, and I'm glad he's got a reference on page 15 to the bridge over the railway tracks at Cambridge, which I think funded and was delighted to be part of opening. On the risk issue, can I ask him if he'd kindly suggest or agree with me that comparisons of risk per distance travelled are ludicrous for comparing walking, cycling and driving and flying, and we ought to have risk per hour exposed, which gives people a far greater sense of the relative safety of cycling.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and I thank him for his support for Cambridge cycling. Statistics can say all sorts of things. The most dangerous form of travel per trip is the space shuttle, and the safest per mile, per passenger mile, is also the space shuttle, which I think shows the extremes. Now, I'm going to make some progress because there are a lot of people who wish to speak in this debate. So our report makes 18 recommendations in 5 key themes. The first of these is about having sustained investment in cycling to improve the infrastructure. The European standard is to have funds on the order of £10 per person per year, hopefully rising to £20 per person per year. That is the sort of level that the Dutch have sustained that we need to make the difference. It will not happen overnight, but the benefits will substantially outweigh the costs, according to almost every single study which has been seen. And of course, many of the improvements that would benefit cyclists, such as improvements to road quality, segregated cycle tracks, junction changes, will also benefit pedestrians and other road users. There is no conflict. The lady was very patient, so I will take her.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank the honourable gentleman for securing this debate. I want to draw the House's attention to the death in July of Philippine de Guerin Ricard in my constituency, a 20-year-old student who was tragically killed while she was cycling. And previously, in the previous year, 2 others were killed on the ring road. And I fully support his point about the need for investment to make roads safer, both for drivers as well as cyclists. And can he say a bit more about what can be done to reduce the number of minor and major injuries that have increased by 29% in the last year, a dramatic increase between 2005 and 2009 from that period.
I think the point of a lot of what I will say will be about how we can reduce that. Some of it is about infrastructure, some of it is about measures such as making heavy goods vehicles safer, which I will come on to talk about in more detail. No, I would like to make progress, otherwise I'm afraid other people will not have the chance to speak. So we have to make sure that other bodies, local and national, local authorities, the Highways Agency, allocate proportionate funds to cycling. So when you have a major road scheme like the A14 in my constituency, there are also appropriate cycle facilities along it or across it. Other departments should get involved. There are benefits to health, education, sport, business. They should step out of their silos and get involved as well. We need to make the roads and cities fit. We need planners to have consideration for cyclists and pedestrians right at the start of all developments, whatever sort they are. A new design guidance to provide a modern standard, not just paint on a pavement, which annoys cyclists and pedestrians alike. And local authorities can get on with the small schemes as well, and the Highways Agency too, who have agreed to our call for a programme to reduce the barriers their roads can call to cycling. I'm not going to give way for a bit longer. Road travel is never perfectly safe. There is a lot that we can do to make it safer. Infrastructure is key. There are other things we can do. 20-mile-an-hour zones, which have been supported by this government, are clearly beneficial both for the safety of pedestrians and cyclists, but also for the perceptions of safety for people who want to cycle or take their children. And some rural lanes could be appropriate for a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. Now, honourable members have talked about the number of tragic deaths. And sadly, too many of these have involved cyclists and heavy goods vehicles. There have been steps from the Mineral Products Association, CEMEX and others try to make steps. We need to push further for better vehicle design, better controls, and also to encourage HGVs not to use busy roads at peak times. Crossrail has led the way in much of this. I'm sorry, I would like to make a bit more progress. Road traffic laws are broken too often and should be enforced for all road users. And when a serious driving offence happens, especially if it results in death or injury, it must be treated seriously by police, prosecutors and judges. Far too often the sentences imposed are frankly trivial. But we also need to encourage people to ride positively. Cycling should be seen as a safe and a normal activity for people of all ages and backgrounds, as it is in the Netherlands. I would like to make more progress. I will give way later. And education will help. Bikeability should be available at all schools, and adults should also have the chance to learn to ride. And we need political leadership. I'll give way after this point. It's good to see the Secretary of State come in at this point. We need political leadership, not just nice words from senior politicians, though I am very pleased that the Prime Minister personally wanted to announce the very substantial extra funding we recently had, but sustained support, a cross-departmental action plan with annual progress reports, a national cycling champion, a clear ambition to increase cycling, and for government at all levels to have a lead politician responsible for cycling. I'll take one from each side. Yes.
Can I congratulate the honourable member on this whole debate on cycling and his colleagues, but he knows of my long-term interest as chairman of PACS in safety on the roads. And is he not worried that at least a third of youngsters getting on a bike don't have any bikeability training and don't have training? And secondly, on the question of HGV, he's absolutely right. But what are we going to do about those the people that have their steering on the other side and have terrible blind spots, and they are causes of much of the terrible accidents we have?
I thank the gentleman for his comment and for the support the PACT has given to our report, along with many other organisations. I do think there should be more training for people. It shouldn't be compulsory, but we want to encourage people to be comfortable to say, and there is a lot more about heavy goods vehicles we can deal with. I said I'd take one from this side. I should take one of my own colleagues.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and as somebody who's cycled in the UK and in Holland, does my honourable friend share my concern that sometimes we have meaningless bits of paint on pavements where there are trees in the middle of the cycle routes, and what we really need is segregated cycle paths?
I can see you're in free will, but I'm going to put the brake on. We said 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm sure a couple of minutes you will have finished. Dr. Julian Huppert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We all benefit from improving the take-up of cycling. And to quote the President of the Automobile Association, Edmund King, implementation of the Get Britain cycling recommendations would bring tangible business and economic benefits by reducing congestion, absenteeism, NHS costs, and by producing a more creative and active workforce. There speaks the voice of the automobile, and I entirely agree with him. However, despite these benefits, governments for decades have not sufficiently supported cycling. There's been massive investment in road infrastructure, but with little for cycling, and cyclists have often had small-scale provision, if any. There have been individual ministers who've tried, but they've not always had the support that they need. I pay great tribute, in particular, to the current Minister, the member for Lewis, I believe the longest-serving Minister for Cycling ever. But he is not able to deliver as much as he and I believe, would like. He's done things like the local Sustainable Transport Fund, the extra money just recently announced over the summer, but we need more, and it needs to be sustained. Many ministers face a culture that points the other way, who focus on car drivers only to the detriment, not realising that fewer cyclists would mean more cars on the road. And I hope that one of the outcomes of our report and of this debate is to provide support for ministers of all parties who want to make that difference, to turn welcome comments like those from the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition into reality. The Prime Minister said on the 12th of August, "Cycle will be at the heart of future road development." I hope we can make sure, with the impetus from this debate, from the Times Cities Fit for Cycling campaign, the excitement of the Olympics, the double Tour de France victory, that we can make sure that that actually becomes a reality. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, Ian Austin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for enabling this debate to take place. I want to thank everybody who took part in the 3-month inquiry, British Cycling, the CTC and Sustrans, and the other organisations who helped us run it. I want to thank in particular Chris Boardman, MBE, Olympic gold medalist, world champion, great man, fantastic campaigner for cycling, for everything he does to promote cycling in Britain and for supporting our inquiry. Phil Goodwin, Adam Kaufman, who pulled the report together and organised the inquiry, have been mentioned. I want to thank actually News International for sponsoring the inquiry. Their involvement came as a result of the Times' brilliant campaign for cycling, which has been a real breakthrough, I think, for cycling. I want to pay tribute to the current editor, John Witherell, and his predecessor, James Harding, Kaya Burgess, Phil Pank and Phil Webster, who worked so hard on this campaign. Brilliant campaigning journalism at its best. Now, their campaign, as we just heard a moment ago, was triggered by the tragic incident in 2011, which injured their colleague, Mary Bowers, so badly that she's still not regained consciousness. The driver who hit her was giving directions over the phone at the time. Mary was in his direct line of sight for at least 10 seconds, but he failed to spot her. He was found guilty of careless driving, fined £2,700 and banned from driving for just 8 months. So I want to start by welcoming the Ministry of Justice's review of what are all too often derisory sentences handed down to drivers when cyclists are killed or injured. But we also need a comprehensive review of the justice system from beginning to end to ensure the police enforce the law properly and the CPS prosecute people on stronger charges. Of course.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for giving way. We not also agree that if we had a lower speed limit for all road users, it would make life safer for cyclists and indeed pedestrians?
I do agree with her, and one of the recommendations of our report with 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in urban areas, something the Times has been campaigning for. But I'd also like to pay tribute to the contribution she made to the inquiry. I don't think the inquiry would have been such a success, and certainly the report wouldn't have been written in the way it was if she hadn't done so much on this.
Does my honourable friend agree with me? And I thank my honourable friend for giving way that a lot more could be done in terms of school in relation to cycling proficiency, because safety is a very big element. And equally, should the local authorities not do more in a general term to have a good look at traffic management schemes?
He's completely right on this, and he did a lot of work on this when he was the leader of Coventry City Council before becoming a Member of Parliament here. Now, I don't want to criticise the Minister for Cycling personally. He's a good man, he fights hard for cycling, he's a keen cyclist himself, but I think it is fair to say that the government's response to our inquiry has been disappointing, to say the least. Their response promised, quote, "Cycling will be at the heart of future road development." It said, and I quote, "The government is committed to turning Britain into a cycling nation to rival our European neighbours." Now, if there's one question the Minister answers in this debate, will he tell us how those two promises can be squared, can be taken seriously, when the Netherlands spends 25 per head on cycling, here in the UK, £2, the highways budget in the UK is 15 billion, the funds announced for cycling, 159 million, no dedicated funding stream that would allow for local authorities to plan for more than 2 years. Our report makes a series of recommendations to boost cycling from less than 2% of journeys in 2011 to 25% by 2050. And I'd like to ask the Minister why his department's response didn't commit the government to those targets. We also want a national cycling champion to lead a drive for 10% of all journeys in Britain to be by bike by 2025. And I'd like to add, as I say, the Minister fights hard for cycling. He's done a very good job to put cycling on the agenda to the extent that it has been. But the fact is, and I'm not being critical of him personally, but the fact is that he's a junior minister in the junior party in the coalition. It's always going to be difficult for him on this, when we need, I think, someone with cabinet-level clout to get different departments working together, on this. And I'd like to ask... And I'd like to ask And I'd like to ask the Minister why the government has not agreed to the appointment, why the government's not agreed to the appointment of a cycling champion. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for Oxford East, unfortunately can't be here today because of health issues with two members of his family. But he wanted to call for a more comprehensive cycling strategy. He asked me to relate to the House. He welcomes the £835,000 grant to improve cycling safety of the Plain in Oxford, but points out that it's a tiny fraction of the money needed to bring Oxford's cycle network up to an entirely safe standard. We think more of the transport budget should be spent on supporting cycling at an initial rate of at least £10 per person per year, increasing as cycling levels go up. So I welcome the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport's, the Right Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood's recent announcement to spend a proportion of road spending to build long-term cycling infrastructure. I think it's fair to say that most of the spending mentioned in the government's response had already been announced, so I'd like to ask the Minister why his department won't shift resources in this way. London spent 5 times the amount per person on cycling for the last 10 years compared to the rest of the UK, and the benefits are clear with the huge growth of cycling in the capital. Just on that point. No, I don't want to take any more because I want to get everything in so everybody else can speak too. And given the benefits to the economy and the huge savings that cycling could bring to the NHS, it will bring huge benefits in the long run. The truth is that cyclists are fitter and healthier than the population as a whole. They're less of a demand on the NHS. So can the Minister tell us why last week the Department of Health, with a budget of £1 billion, committed to cycling just £1 million to be spent over the next 2 years. Now, making cycling safer in local residential streets would also help on this, which is why our report, as we said earlier, calls for lower speed limits in urban areas, and the Times campaign wants 20 miles an hour to be the default limit in residential areas without cycle lanes. We need the government to ensure cycling provision and safety is properly considered at the outset of all major developments. This is a central point made by British Cycling's Road Safety Manifesto. And so again, I'm really pleased that my right honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, is committing to the introduction of new cycle safety assessments for all new transport schemes. But given that local roads and planning are the responsibility of local councils, it's a shame that the Secretary of State for CLG has been indulging in populist calls for councils to ignore cycling and do more to help motorists. Now, the truth is, I'm a cyclist and I'm a motorist. Most of us are both. Most of us are both. In fact, cyclists are more likely to own a car than the general population. So let's have no more of this cheap populist nonsense that tries to set drivers against cyclists, when we should all be working together to improve safety on the roads. Finally, I'd just like to say this. This debate is just the next stage of our campaign to get Britain cycling. We should use this inquiry, this debate today. I think it's fantastic. There's so many MPs here in the chamber for a debate on the first day back when there's a one-line whip and all the rest of it. But we should be using this inquiry, this debate, to drive cycling up the agenda. Let's make cycling a real election issue. Let's get cyclists locally campaigning, getting candidates to sign pledges. Let's get the parties to compete. Compete to produce the best manifesto for cycling at the election, so that we can continue the campaign to get Britain cycling. Thank you.
Steve Bryan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was fortunate enough to sit as part of the Get Britain Cycling inquiry earlier this year. I think it's fair to say there was huge interest in what we were doing. I think we were the best trending name on Twitter when we started the thing, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, for securing the debate, and Adam Kaufman, who we mentioned, who put so much work into making it a professional, select committee-style inquiry, basically. In the short time available to me, I just want to focus, if I may, on 3 areas. The vision and leadership thing, which is for me where it starts and ends, the design issue, and touch on my own constituency's Summer of Cycling, which we've just concluded. Generally speaking, I have to say I'm extremely proud of this report. I think it stands up really well, actually, as a piece of work. And reading it again in writing up these remarks, I think it'll age well. In the light of everything that's happened since we produced the report, we launched it back in April, and the government's response last week, I think it's more relevant now, actually, than it was when we launched it. So, touching on leadership, it's no coincidence that one of the first points we make in the report is the need for vision, ambition, and what we call strong political leadership. And we recommend the appointment, as the Honourable Member for Dudley North has said, a national cycling champion. And I share his regret, actually, that it's not accepted in the government response announced last week. I think all too often it's easy for it to be somebody else's responsibility, and I think the Minister needn't look much further than City Hall, where Andrew Gilligan is the Mayor's cycling champion, for a very good example to follow of where a cycling champion can actually work. Yeah, sure.
Thank him for his comments. Would he agree with me that leadership at local level is really important? I've certainly seen the difference in my borough, where over the years I've been there, as political leadership there has started to take this issue much more seriously, engage much more vigorously with local cycling campaigners, and it's really making a difference.
Yeah, it's funny she should say that. The next line in my remarks is, we say in our report that every local authority should appoint a lead politician responsible for cycling, and I do want this report to give birth to mini Borises across the country. It's exactly what we. Bearing in mind that we didn't launch the report until April, it's quite a small gestation period, but we do say that we want a lead politician in every local authority, and I find it bizarre, actually, that we even needed to say that. In Winchester, we've had a cycling champion for a long time, long before this report was produced, but for me, it can't be a K-champion, it has to be a council that's absolutely the heart of the administration, as it should be here at national level, with the necessary political clout and authority to drive stuff through with their colleagues at cabinet level and with the key officers and the chief executives. The cycling action plan shouldn't be marked in the cycling folder. It should be part of the health strategy, the tourism, the economic strategy of the council, and then it is integral to the part of that council making it work. I wonder how many MPs in the House today have sent a copy of this report, or even email with the link, to their chief executive, to their leader of their local council. I wonder how many know the cycling champion in their areas and know what he or she actually, who they are, and more importantly, what they do. So what I'm trying to do, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my constituency is not be the lead councillor for cycling. If I wanted to be a councillor, I could have a far easier life. But what I'm trying to... yeah. How to... I noticed the double hatters here looking at me with that, how to win friends and influence councillors. But what I'm trying to do is push the agenda, push the issue up the agenda locally, working with the marvellous councillors that I have in my constituency. And I hope to sit down very soon with the councillors in Winchester and the councillors at Hampshire County Council and start putting some lines on some maps. Indeed.
I'm very grateful to him, and I think he's genuine in his praise for councillors such as the lead member in Swindon, Councillor Keith Williams, who is a triathlete and passionate cyclist. And would he agree with me that it is with local leadership like the one I've just described that we will improve cycling facilities in towns like Swindon, and with funding from the Department for Transport for improved links between West Swindon and the town centre, that is an example of how cyclists will find it safer in the long term.
Yeah, I would. And, when I say about putting lines on maps, that's an expression I borrowed from Andrew Gilligan, who came to see the all-party group just actually on the eve of launching the Mayor's cycling strategy for London. And one of the things that he took us through was it wasn't easy in putting lines on the maps in London. The TfL land, they had the boroughs, that land belonged to the borough, and somebody had to try and pull that together. And it was the leadership of the Mayor and of Andy. I won't, if you don't mind, just because time is so tight and I know everyone wants to get in. But the way that he did that, to chisel out the cross-rail for cyclists, is impressive, and it is actually a real blueprint of what people should be doing. I see, and I know what they're doing in Swindon. In my constituency, we've made significant progress with National Cycle Network 23, for instance, but somebody there needs to grab the bull by the horns, or grab the highlighter pen, if you like, and sit down and put those lines on the maps, and then that leadership can really shine through. Now, will that happen? ultimately, it requires the leader of that council to do that. And Councillor Keith Wood, who leads the majority council in my constituency, is somebody who is interested in cycling, is a keen cyclist, but I want to see passion from him, and I want to see more leadership from him on that, and he knows that. Secondly, design and planning. I'm a passionate believer, especially on main busy roads, in segregated cycle routes. I've seen them in other parts of the continent. It has to make sense, Madam Deputy Speaker, particularly if we're hopeful of getting young children to stay cycling, especially after they've got their driving licence. We recommend in the report, and those who've read it will know, a statutory requirement that cyclists' needs are considered at an early stage of all new development schemes. And of course I welcome the new National Planning Policy Framework introduced in 2011, which sets out clearly that including facilities for cycling and walking should be part of delivering sustainable development. But we all know, at present, too often they're not. And that is such a wasted opportunity in my book. What's set out in the NPF needs to catch up, needs to become the norm quickly. Wayne, if you don't mind. I've got one such opportunity in my constituency right now where the developer Carla Holmes have permission for 2,000 houses on the highly controversial, to put it mildly, Barton Farm site. And the developer was an early recipient of a copy of this report. And my challenge to them now here today is to make us proud of your development at Barton Farm. Put cycling at the heart of your development, not just in new cycle routes into and through, but in linking up with existing cycle connections. And you will make a lot of people very pleased with you after gathering your planning permission in the way that you did. So we also say that local authorities should seek to deliver cycle-friendly improvements across existing roads, including small improvements and segregated routes. Yes, of course, they should, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we're not going to... But, you know, I just want to say that I'm not a dyed-in-the-lycra person on this. I'm realistic. Winchester's ancient Saxon streets are not suddenly going to all have segregated cycle routes, but there are some great opportunities in my constituency for us to do that. And finally, we say about the Highways Agency, they should draw up a programme to remove the barriers to cycling. Junction 9 of the M3, and the Minister knows the junction I'm referring to, Junction 9 of the M3 has received a significant amount of government funding for pinch point improvements that will be done later this year. What we're doing is taking 2 lanes up to 3. What we're doing is bringing the traffic closer to cyclists, and that seems to me a missed opportunity. So my other challenge is to the Minister and to the Highways Agency to see whether we can look again at Junction 9 of the M3 outside of my constituency, just on the edge of, and come up with something that's a compromise for cyclists and for drivers. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, this report is about getting Britain cycling, and there's so much good stuff that's going on in my constituency and across the country. The VC Venter Cycling Club in Winchester has seen its membership rise by 300% in the years since the Olympics. Our Cycle Fest this summer in Winchester, culminating with the Criterium high-speed cycle rate through Winchester on the 11th of August, was fantastic. So get Britain cycling, yeah, we're doing it, but we really need to scale it up, and this report is part of the blueprint as how we do that.
Christopher Wayne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2006, the Rill Cycling Club in my constituency, 4 members of the Rill Cycling Club in my constituency were killed in the worst ever cycling accidents in British history. They were Tom Harland, aged 14, Maurice Broadbent, aged 61, Dave Horrocks, aged 55, and Wayne Wilkes, aged 42. Young Tom Harland actually visited. I took him round the House of Commons 2 years prior to that. His father, John Harland, was a personal friend of mine. The club and the families involved were faced with a decision whether they crumple personally and as a club, or whether they thrive, and they chose to thrive. And since 2006, I'd just like to outline some of the successes in my constituency for cycling that I think could be replicated around the country. John Harland got together a group of people, including a chap called Gren Kershaw, who was the ex-local head of our local health board, and they got together an idea, a vision for cycling in my constituency based around Marsh Tracks. In the intervening years, Marsh Tracks has opened, and it includes a 5-star BMX track with an Olympic starting gate. It includes a £1.2 million flood-lit off-road cycleway. It's is now being extended with a mountain bike track extending over a 3-kilometre area. These are fantastic cycling facilities. The local authority has developed miles and miles of off-road cycleways connecting the towns of Rhyl, Prestatyn, Rydlan, St Asaph, Dizzard, Bodelwyddan, connecting the Rhyl College, the local hospital, the St Asaph Business Park. All of these key sites are connected off-road to the cycleways. Yes, because I want the extra minute.
For his generosity, and he's making a very powerful speech, and many constituents have asked me to come to this debate today to make representations on their behalf, but in particular on behalf of their children, who they, cyclists themselves, worry not only for themselves and their safety, but the safety of their children. And many of them have asked to press the Minister on making cycle urban infrastructure development compulsory as part of the legislation dealing with cycling and urban planning. Does he agree?
I think I've lost that minute. But you owe me 15 seconds. I agree with my right honourable friend, and I'll be coming to the educational side of that in a moment. We're successful in getting £4.5 million to build a purpose-built cycling bridge over the Forrid Harbour in my constituency. This will be part of the Sus Transnational Coastal Cycle Network around the UK. I'm having a meeting in September the 26th with Network Rail to see if we can get a disused railway to connect this coastal path to the country paths further inland. They're currently cut across by a railway bridge. We want to use an adjacent railway bridge to connect the coastal to the country. So our coast will be connected to the castles and the cathedrals in my constituency. I met recently with Adrian Walls, a DCC cycleways officer, who has developed this mountain bike route in my constituency. It's not actually finished yet. It'll probably be finished in about 6 weeks. It will be a state-of-the-art mountain bike route. And these fantastic facilities have been developed that I've outlined in my speech so far, but I don't think that they're being used sufficiently. I think the task is, how do we connect, how do we get the pupils in our schools, in our colleges, how do we get the workers to use these facilities? Multi-million-pound investments, which I believe in my constituency are underutilised. How do we make them the most of it? And so I've met with these officers, and they've come up with a vision. Talking with these officers and enthusiasts, they've come up with a vision for a centre of cycling excellence in my constituency, where it will be tied into the back to work agenda, where cycle maintenance, importing cycles, assembling cycles, selling cycles will be used to train local people, some of them unemployed, in some of the poorest wards in Wales, to use this fantastic facility on our doorstep. We spoke about how we tie it into the health agenda. Denbighshire's got high obesity levels. How do we get the GPs to do cycling prescriptions? It's been done in other areas. It's been done in London. Brent have done it. Tower Hamlets have done it. The people are suffering with diabetes. They're suffering with arthritis, a whole range of medical illnesses, which would benefit tremendously from cycling. So if it's been done in Brent, if it's been done in Tower Hamlets, and why can it not be done across the whole of the country? If we have these fantastic facilities, safe facilities in my constituency, why can't we use them? There's floodlit, we could be using it for 16 hours a day. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, because what he's outlining is the need to actually get cooperation in order to achieve across a whole area of policy, from health services, local government, from sport and recreation, and that will only be achieved if there is a cross-government message coming out from the very top. That's not just for cycling, that's for sport and recreational and physical activities right across the board.
Absolutely, and I think all of us in here, when we attended school, would have been sent to swimming lessons. I think cycling lessons should be on a par with that. You're much more likely to use your, no I'm afraid I won't, to use your cycle than you are to go to the local baths. So I think the profile needs to be raised in education, and it does need leadership, and it needs leadership from the top. Departments should talk, and to departments, the health department, the education department, the transport departments, and I think if we can train those young people and train them properly and safely. One of the ideas we discussed in the recent meetings was to have a safe area where you can take toddlers as young as 2 or 3 to teach them how to cycle. So you'd be in a centre like we're developing in Rill, you could be taking them at 2 or 3 years of age, and you could be teaching 90-year-olds to regain the confidence to get back on their bikes. You know, it's from cradle to grave cycling that I think we should be advocating. So there's a lot has been done in my constituency, and a lot more needs to be done. I think it could transform tourism in many areas. My hometown of Rill is a seaside town, and the Prime Minister said it was neglected a few weeks ago. I think he's only ever visited it once for 10 minutes in the whole of his life. We're having £200 million worth of investment in my hometown, including a £17 million new harbour with a £4.5 million dedicated cycle route, a cycle bridge in the harbour. I think the potential of tourism in cycling is massive. I will give way.
For giving way, and I would agree with him. In my High Peak constituency, we've already just had some government money towards our Peak Pedal project, and we look forward to welcoming an influx of cyclists of all abilities to come and enjoy the benefits of the Peak District.
That's right, it is about cyclists of all abilities, cyclists of all ages. It's about the people who learned to cycle when they were children who have lost the confidence. And there are millions of people out there who won't go back on a bicycle because they've lost that confidence. And there's a chance in developing facilities around the country, like we've got in my constituency, that can give people that confidence back. So I reflect back on the terrible tragedy that we experienced in 2006. It was a bad thing that happened, but good came of it.
Michael Thornton.
Speaker. First, I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend on securing this fantastic debate. He's long been a vocal advocate of cycling. I pay tribute to his tireless work on this issue. And I also congratulate everyone else on the all-party group who've done such a fantastic job. I won't speak that long, but I haven't got that long, so that's okay. I'm sure you're pleased about that. But I would like to emphasise really the health benefits and the economic benefits we've heard of before. And also my own experience of cycling, I'm afraid I sort of used to cycle a lot when I was less well off and gave up when I could afford a car. But I have cycled into my local town of Eastie for shopping and other occasions, and it doesn't feel that safe. And one of my best friends, who's a physicist by profession, has cycled all over the country, and his comments and knowledge is invaluable. And I think the uncertainty principle applies to his cycling as well. But as a parent, I remember disagreeing with my daughter on her wearing a helmet. Now, I know this is contentious. Some people say wearing a helmet is good, and some people say it's bad. But I do remember that whatever one's views on that, I think one has to admit that parents, rightly or wrongly, do feel their hearts in their mouths when they see their child go out cycling. And I think that's probably one of the constraints on children cycling at the moment.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yes, of course. Yes.
I thank you for giving way, and he's making a very important point on wearing of cycle helmets. And independent studies have clearly shown that wearing of cycle helmets saves lives and cuts down on injuries. Last year I called on the Department to commission a definitive and independent report on the benefits and costs of introducing a law requiring children to wear a cycle helmet. Would he welcome such a report himself?
I think there is a difficulty with the wearing of cycling helmets. I personally tried to get my daughter to wear a cycling helmet, and she stopped cycling. And I don't know whether I did the right thing. I don't know whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, on trying to enforce her to do that, because she did stop cycling, but also I worried a bit less. Yes.
Very interesting that he says that his daughter stopped cycling when she was forced to wear a helmet, because that's exactly what happened in Australia. When they introduced a law requiring people to wear helmets, cycling numbers plummeted. The way you make cycling safe is to get more people on their bikes. More people cycling, the safer it is. That's how we make cycling safer in Britain.
I must admit, I don't know the answer, having my brother having come off a bicycle and was very badly injured because he wasn't wearing a helmet, so I'm in two minds about the argument, but I understand both sides. I'm a father and a brother. What do you expect? But anyway, let me, if I could move on. You know, but we are fortunate in Eastleigh to have over 44 kilometres of, or how many is that miles, 30-odd miles of dedicated cycling routes within the borough. And it's difficult because of the criss-crossing motorways, railway lines and watercourses, and the honourable member from Winchester, my neighbour, has mentioned some of the problems there. But indeed, part of the Sustrans Cycle Network 24 is routed directly behind my constituency office in Lee Road, if anyone can remember that from a certain election. We also have a National Cycle Route 20 through, again mentioned by my honourable neighbour from Winchester, stretching from Reading to the Isle of Wight, and National Right Cycle 2, which runs along the coastline all the way to St Austell down in Cornwall, and I believe my honourable colleague friend from Cornwall's left. And we're immensely proud, of course, to have Danny King as one of our gold medal winners. And you would think that with all of that, that cycling in Eastleigh would be on the up. Unfortunately, the number of people cycling to work has continued to stick around 2% in Eastleigh. And one would think it would be a lot better than that, especially when one considers how effective the borough environmental policies have been under the lead of Councillor Bloom in green policies. So did I just... Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make an intervention in this very important and popular debate. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the real issue here about cycling to work is also the link between cyclists and the public transport system, and that we should make it easier for people to store bikes in various places such as railway stations, and that would encourage people to link up with the public transport?
Oh, I'd entirely agree with that, and I think I've noticed it's quite difficult sometimes to get a bicycle on a train, which I think is a great shame, and I think that should be encouraged as well, as much as possible, with perhaps special more areas for buses, and locking up a bicycle. Can I just keep going, do you think? And more areas where you can actually put your bicycle safely when you're going to work. I think that this APG report, it sets out perfectly why this status quo has been maintained. Nearly half of Britain's own will have access to a bike, but we don't use them. And I think, again, safety is the #1 concern, even if it's not a particularly rational reason. We're still frightened for us and our children particularly. So I think extending 20-mile-an-hour zones, as the report proposes, is extremely important. But also, as other members have mentioned, we need to do something about HGVs, because we can't always blame an HGV because they can't see a cyclist. And I think we need to make sure they have better visibility and sensors to minimise the risk to cyclists, but we also need to make our cyclists realise that they can't necessarily be seen. And that's particularly difficult with children who don't have our road sense when we've grown up. And further to that, many of my constituencies have told me how dangerous road services are. Just trying to swerve around a pothole, around other bits of street furniture, can cause all sorts of problems. And these indicative lines, as my honourable friend from Winchester mentioned, these indicative lines that just don't really tell you anything. I know, I'm coming into Winchester actually, and I know it's outside my constituency, so I apologise, but there's some nice pictures of bicycles, and you'd say, yes, that's a lovely picture of a bicycle. What good on earth is that doing? Segregated bicycle lanes, as I mentioned, is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. So new developments should be cycle-proof. I entirely agree. And they should be incorporated into all planning policies, that when you build a new development, again, in my constituency where we get new developments, they should be cycle-proofed. But the thing is this pays for itself. I think we'd all agree this completely pays for itself. In the full APG, I read that cycling demonstration towns, there's a 27% increase in cycling from 2005 to 2009, 27%. And the estimated benefits of this were nearly £64 million. And that cost 18 million. I think that's a particularly strong piece of evidence. It also showed that every pound spent on cycling issues can save £4 in cost to the NHS. Again, economics wins the argument. But I do welcome the Prime Minister's recent announcements to increase funding for cycling, but the lion's share of that's going to 8 select cities, 7 of which already are exceeding national averages for cycling. In addition, this funding is only earmarked for 2 years. And of course, this announcement is welcome, but what about the rest of us? My constituents in Eastleigh could do with some dosh. And we need a nationwide commitment to increase the per-head cycling budget. I think we're looking for £10 per head by 2025 and up to, 50 by year. And I think that's absolutely vital. So, what I've heard today, it seems there's a remarkable degree of consensus among cycling organisations, cyclists, local authorities and in this House what needs to be done. It's extremely positive and we must ensure that we capitalise upon it and something must be done. So I fully support this motion and the recommenders in the APG and thank the committee for their hard work.
Jim Fitzpatrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Eastleigh. I'd like to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Dudley North and the member for Cambridge, the co-chairs of the all-party group, of which I am a member, for the report which has been produced, sponsored by the Times, and obviously congratulate the Times. I should declare the Times is still in Wapping in my constituency, so there's a little bit of direct self-interest there. But the other national newspapers have been trying to catch up with the Times, the Guardian and I believe the Independent in terms of supporting this whole campaign. And my comments tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, will be as a Londoner and a London cyclist, so they will not necessarily reflect issues in different parts of the country. I invited my constituents through social media, Twitter and Facebook, and through the East London Advertiser to contribute to this debate tonight by raising issues that they thought I might want to mention. And I have to say, I was staggered at the response. Over 50 emailed or tweeted and said, raise this, raise that, these are important issues. So I'm very limited for time and I can't name them all. And all I will do will list some of the issues that have been raised by them. Before doing that, however, I also want to thank the cycle firms in my constituency, Bike Works in particular, which is a social entrepreneurial group which does great work and did a running repair to my bike last Wednesday morning in half an hour to get me back on the road, but also Halfords and Evans, national organisations, which all support cycling in Tower Hamlets and cycling in the community. The list of issues raised by my constituents, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll just run through them. Keeping cycle routes clear when there are roadworks and when there are parking problems, that the cycle superhighways are not up to the necessary standard, and my honourable friend from Bethnal Green and Bow earlier raised the Aldgate fatality, where it's just a coat of paint on the road and nothing more. Lower speed limits were raised by my honourable friend from Dudley North. Cycle training and education in schools, mentioned by several speakers, is absolutely critical. I'm doing an Industry and Parliament Trust Fellowship on logistics, and I've spent some time with TNT. They have trainers who train their postal delivery people to ride their bikes, and when they've got downtime, they go into schools and partner up with local schools to train kids in schools. If TNT can do it, the question to the Minister is Royal Mail doing it? Because there must be other companies out there who also could contribute to this. HGV, I'm happy to give it to one more thing.
Royal Mail is doing it. They have a cycle workshop in my constituency in York that maintains 500 bicycles for which are used by the Royal Mail in the Greater York area.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the extra time that he's given me, and I knew that somebody would respond positively on behalf of Royal Mail also. The question's been raised about HGVs and the fear factor. There's a question raised about a road deaths investigation board and improved statistics for cycle serious injuries and fatalities. Now, I know that the Home Office and Department for Transport have always resisted a fatalities inquiry board for road traffic fatalities because there are just too many of them. But I think we've got to raise the bar here and look more seriously at investigating more thoroughly the fatalities we're having on roads. Congestion charging and road closures to force traffic to surrender more space to cyclists, advanced stop areas, earlier green lights for cyclists, and promotion of enforcement and blitz enforcement of transgressors, whether they are cars or cyclists, at these advanced areas. Cycle storage has been raised. Mandatory helmets has been raised, and I know that many people are opposed to that. Personally, I'm in favour, but it's not going to happen, and I think the evidence against it
is somewhat time limited, and it's coming from Australia and America. I think if we get our kids using helmets in schools, then that will graduate them into it. Of course, to give way to numbers.
No one who is in favour of cycling should be against encouraging people to wear helmets, but will he accept that not just from Australia, but the overwhelming evidence from all over the world is where cycle helmets have been made compulsory, the impact on cycling has been very negative, and therefore the overall public health impact has been also very negative?
Well, I hear what an honourable friend says, and I do think there's a cultural question here. If you watched, as we all did, I'm sure, the 100th running of the Tour de France this year, and you looked at historic footage, none of those cyclists were wearing helmets, all the way down the decades. Every Tour de France rider now wears a helmet. That's professional leadership. That's people who are in the game of minimising and mitigating risk, and they're giving the lead to cyclists in the country, and I think it will happen. If I have time at the end, I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman, but I want to get through the points from my constituents. The last two negatives that they raised were fatalities and the punishment to fit the crime, and we all know the tragic stories that we're hearing from constituents about punishments which do not fit the crimes which are being committed, and the conversion of wider pavements, and Boris certainly has that in London, particularly on the embankment. What was fascinating to me was the counterculture that came through from my constituent cyclists, complaining about other cyclists and complaining about bad cycling behaviour. And they were saying that the cycle demographic in our country is mainly young, white, aggressive and male. And that's why we do not go Dutch. And that's why we put off many people from cycling in this country, because they see a racetrack and they don't want to join it. And we need to actually address that. And the only way we are going to address it is to get enforcement of people crossing red lights and crashing through pedestrian crossings. They are also complaining about cyclists disregarding the rules, wearing earphones, running red lights, crashing pedestrian crossings, not signalling whether they're travelling left or right, not warning when they're overtaking, riding on pavements, using their mobile, speeding on the Thames path, not ringing to alert pedestrians or other cyclists that they're overtaking on toll bus, swearing at pedestrians because some cyclists think, like some drivers think, that they're entitled to a free run at the road, not dismounting in foot tunnels, not having lights, not having bells and not wearing high-vis. Now, cyclists aren't perfect, and we've got to give a lead to cyclists to say we should be showing by our example the way that we should be behaving to make sure that drivers behave the way we want them to. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, my wife Sheila and I visited Amsterdam and Copenhagen recently. There is less racing, there is more sensible cycling, and there is a much wider demographic. There is a different culture, and we must have that more varied demographic in our country. My right honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, in a recent statement, asked two questions of the government. Why is it we have annual road and rail budgets to 2021 and not for cycling? Why is it that we don't have cycle safety assessments similar to economic and equality impact assessments for all road schemes? And my final question, raised in the report, and I'm not quite clear from the government's response to the report, it says we should have champions. I've got 10 seconds to let the honourable gentleman in.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. The issue about cycle helmets is they might save some lives, but the countervailing loss of life from people not cycling, from being less fit, massively outweighs it. It's been suggested, one academic analysis, an extra 250 deaths a year or so, net.
Grateful to that. It's an argument, it's a discussion that needs to be had, and I'm very happy to make sure that we're raising it tonight. My final question to the Minister is that the report says we should have national, regional, city champions. The government's response isn't clear whether he is the national champion or he's not the national champion. If he isn't, he should be, and when is he going to recruit his regional and citywide teams?
Dr. Sarah Wollaston. Speaker. First, the good news. If you start cycling in middle age, then you're going to have a fitness level that makes you effectively 10 years younger. Just think what that would achieve for everybody in this chamber. Not only that, not only that, but your life expectancy would increase by 2 years. So the benefits to risk ratio is around 20 to 1. So whatever else happens in this debate and the discussions we have about reducing the risks and improving the safety of cyclists, let's not forget the benefit and the joy of cycling and persuade as many people as possible to get cycling. And if we're going to get Britain cycling, we've got to consider the persuasive arguments about the benefits. And if we look at the problems with obesity, that's currently costing the NHS around £5 billion a year. And even if, I'm speaking from personal experience, cycling doesn't necessarily make you skinny, it's better to be fit and a little bit flabby than not to be fit and a little bit flabby. But what I'd say as well about this is it's not just about the physical health benefits, it's also about the mental health benefits. Even the effects that have been shown on brain ageing for people who manage to keep fit. And what I would suggest, and I would ask the Secretary of State perhaps in his response to address, is the Health Economic Assessment Tool, which is adopted by the World Health Organization. And the heat, if you like, is it. And I wonder, could the Secretary of State say whether such an assessment has been done perhaps for high speed too? Because what I would say is that I can't help thinking that we would leave a far happier, lasting and healthier legacy for Britain if we spent just a fraction of the spending that we're spending on HS2, and possibly even both. But,
Will I take it away?
Of course, yes.
I'm very grateful to my friend for giving way. I certainly have been listening to her very carefully, and what she said about the medical improvements to one's health are fascinating. Would she agree with me that a lot of money is going to be spent in the conurbations in London, but it's very important that the rural areas are not neglected in this great drive to get more people cycling? And would you agree with me that on small rural lanes, cyclists obviously are at a big disadvantage, and we do need more rural speed limits. We need more investment in safer highways in the rural areas.
Thank you, honourable friend. Indeed, yes, rural speed limits are very important, and in fact the introduction of 40-mile-an-hour speed limits networks of those on rural roads had great benefit in Holland, and there's a lot of evidence to support their use. But it is absolutely about money, and I really welcome the £10 per head in the 8 cities that are going to benefit from this, and certainly welcome the spending, for example, in Dartmoor National Park in my part of the world. But that isn't what the report was calling for. Our report was calling for £10 a head nationally, and to think of the benefits that could achieve, as I say, a real lasting legacy. But it is also, as my honourable friend points out, about speed. If we look at the benefits we could see if we had 20-mile-an-hour speed limits within urban areas, and too often what we see is highways departments looking at accident data before they make decisions about speed limits. But what we all know is that parents won't let their children cycle in the first place if they don't feel their children are safe, and the perception of safety is very strongly linked to the speed at which the traffic is travelling. And speed limits across the board. I recently visited Falcon Park, just within Torbay. Now, this is a development where it's a park home where there are very many elderly residents who can't walk down the road at all, let alone cross it, because of very high speed traffic. And in any other area where it was residential in that way, the speed limit would have been reduced to 30 miles an hour as a residential zone. So it's not only about 20-mile-an-hour limits within towns and cities on a network of roads, it's about reducing speed across the board and assessing our priorities. Who do we prioritise? Are we prioritising vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists, or are we prioritising the motorist and speed? And I think we completely need to change our priorities in that way in order to actually achieve this. And the point about that is it doesn't take a great deal of money to reduce speed limits, because everyone recognises that there is a financial imperative here. But also, the issue here is not just about reducing the speed, but enforcing it. And we had shocking evidence within our inquiry about a level of complacency towards enforcement. And what I would ask as well, in summing up, whether we could hear what discussions have taken place across government departments to make sure that the very welcome changes towards the issuing of fixed penalty notices for careless driving is also going to extend to actually penalising people who breach speed limits directly, because it's that immediacy of it the immediate consequence that drives change.
Well, my honourable friend,
certainly.
very briefly, I'm sure, like me, she's delighted to see the government chief whip in his place. He must be the grandfather of parliamentary cycling. To see him here. But just on the issue of enforcement, would my honourable friend agree that whilst motorists should absolutely do the right thing and obey the rules, it is incumbent on cyclists also to obey the rules, and a small minority of cyclists give most cyclists a bad name on occasion by not obeying the highway code? Would she agree with that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I would certainly agree with that, and if you want to see evidence of how cycling makes you look 10 years younger, you only have to look at the Chief Whip. As they say. But coming back, the point is that, of course, segregated routes are the very best option forward. And, of course, segregated cycling routes are expensive. But sometimes they're not as expensive as they look. And in very many areas, we see examples where very small groups of individuals are allowed to stand in the way of low-cost options to create off-road routes. And I think we need to get to grips with that. I'm very sorry, I've taken 2 interventions, so if you'll forgive me. In my area, for example, the South Devon Railway, who has a bridge that was given to them that was built half with public money, have treated the River Dart as if it's some kind of moat and have prevented the sharing of this bridge. And I feel that these kinds of situations are simply not acceptable. This has to be the only bridge in Devon that keeps communities apart rather than bringing them together. And what I would say is I'd call on the South Devon Railway, all the examples around the country where this is happening, to say that they have the opportunity to increase the sum of human happiness, and in Totnes they have the opportunity to create a link that would join up the National Cycle Network, and in also so doing increase the footfall to their own business, because I think we would all recognise that cycling has enormous benefits beyond health, but in looking at economic benefits for communities. So I really hope that following this debate they'll be listening to this and make a very generous step forward in helping us to create that link. I'd just like to briefly touch on the issue of cycle helmets, because that has been brought up today. And I would agree with the Honourable Gentleman Member for Exeter that actually the trouble with introducing these is actually you get a net reduction in cycling. And of course, if you have a cycle helmet, it's sensible to wear it. But I would just ask Honourable Members to think what would happen across London to the wonderful Boris Bike scheme if we introduced compulsory helmets. Simply no one would use them. And I think that's something we have to bear in mind. So yes, of course, if you have a helmet, wear it, but please don't be put off by it. And most importantly, don't be put off and feel that you need special kit. Cycling is for everyone. Cycling will make you live longer, that's the statistics, live longer and happier. And so let's remember the joys of cycling, get Britain cycling, and put the money to make it happen.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a previous chairman of the all-party cycling group in what seems like the distant past of the 1997 Parliament, I have to say I'm delighted by the profile which cycling has gained in the last 16 years. The fact that we're having this debate, and it is, I believe, the best attended debate this House has ever had on cycling, and we're also experiencing, I understand, outside this place, the biggest ever pro-cycling demonstration that this country has ever seen. I've always cycled. As a youngster, my bike gave me independence and freedom to roam. I cycled to school, I've always cycled to work, and I use my bike daily in Exeter and in London. It is simply the best form of transport. And when asked why I am slim at 53, when I eat so much, the answer is simple: my bike. My elderly Dawes Audax is the most important thing in my life, except, I should add, as is outside with the demonstrators, my husband. When I first worked in London in 1991 and cycled to work because it was the quickest and most reliable way to get there, It helped keep me fit and keep my carbon emissions down. I felt like a bit of a freak. It was a very unusual thing to do. I remember fighting during the 1997 Parliament in this place for a single cycle route through Kensington Gardens. It was a hard battle, but it was one that we won. And when I suggested to my local authority in Exeter that it should apply to the then Labour government's cycle demonstration town scheme, I was told, "You won't get anyone cycling here, it's too hilly." Well, Exeter did apply, we got the extra investment, and between 2006 and 2011, cycling rates in Exeter rose by a fantastic 50%. Now, yes, of course I'll give way.
Following on from that point, would the honourable gentleman agree with me that were his council to actually introduce a 20-mile-an-hour limit, then they could have even more dramatic improvements?
Well, I fully accept what my honourable friend says. There is actually a 20-mile-an-hour limit in much of Exeter, but the problem is the Conservative County Council, and I have to say Devon and Cornwall Police, do not enforce it. And this is an issue that needs to be stressed and has been stressed already by a number of members. It's okay and vital we have 20-mile-an-hour limits, but they must be enforced. Not only has cycling increased by 50% in Exeter, but the number of children who cycle to school is now more than 20% when hardly any did before. In London too, the situation has been transformed. Thanks to the congestion charge and other policies initiated by Ken Livingstone, there's also been a cycling revolution here. It warms my heart to see banks of cyclists at all the main junctions at commuting time, particularly young women and even parents with child seats and trailers. And this is the hub of the report we're debating today. In spite of the progress we've made in the last 16 years or so, we are still far behind best practice in the rest of Northern Europe. And without sustained investment and political leadership from the top, we will never catch up. I'm delighted that the Labour Party has today launched its Labour for Cycling campaign. I hope my front bench will sign up fully to implement the recommendations in our report. But we do need the government to act as well. Without that, we will not see the growth in cycling of recent years sustained, nor will we see a reversal of the worrying recent trend of increased cycle deaths and injuries on our roads. Now, I am pleased with some of the things the government has done and announced. The recent commitment to supporting cycling in a number of selected towns and cities is welcome, but it is basically a smaller scale version of Labour's cycling demonstration town. And instead of happening in a few places, it should be happening everywhere. It would only take a fraction of the annual roads budget to achieve that. I would also like to know why the scheme was only available in places that were already part of the government's separate City Deal programme, because that ruled out cities like Exeter applying, which means now that under this government, only a quarter of the amount of money is being invested in cycling in Exeter than it was when Labour was in power. I also deeply regret, and I believe the government does too, the abolition of Cycle England. That was the body that drew all the disparate cycling organisations together and was a vital coordinating voice and deliverer of policy. I also think the government was fatally mistaken to go soft on road safety, abandoning Labour's road death reduction targets and declaring its ridiculous war on speed cameras. However, I am encouraged that the noises coming out of government more recently on road safety have been more sensible, but I still have concern the government is not speaking with one voice. If the government is serious about cycling, why is it allowing the Communities Secretary to go out and make the ludicrous suggestion that vehicles should enjoy a free-for-all parking on double yellow lines, without even mentioning the impact this would have on cyclists and pedestrians in terms of road safety? He then went on to say, the only people in this country who are bothered about cycling are, and I quote, the elite. I don't know if the Communities Secretary's animus to cycling is the result of some deep Freudian consciousness that he is probably the cabinet member who would benefit most from cycling's health-giving and girth-narrowing magic. But his comments are singularly unhelpful, and they should not stand unchallenged if the government is really serious about cycling. Yes, of course, I'll give way.
Does that not make the point that we made in our report so clearly of the need for a national cycling champion with real, dare I say, weight behind him to force this thinking the right way through government at every level?
in future the honourable member might be that person. But no, he's absolutely right. And one of the things I told the inquiry during our hearings was that when I was a minister myself, the only time that we really got peddling, if you'll excuse another pun, on this issue was when you had Secretaries of State in Health, DCMS, Home Office, Transport, everywhere, across all of the important departments who were committed to it, working together and making it happen. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And that leads me to my final point. Time and time again, when our committee was taking evidence on cycling, our witnesses came back to the importance of long-term sustained investment and joined-up political leadership. We need more than a Prime Minister who cycles to work for a photo opportunity while his limo drives behind with his papers. We need a Prime Minister and the whole government, from him down, making clear this is a priority across government because it is cheap, will save lives, improve health, boost productivity, reduce congestion, air pollution and carbon emissions. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a no-brainer. And the infinitesimal cost of doing it will be more than recouped in the form of a happier, healthier, safer, greener, cleaner, thinner and more productive nation in a very short time indeed.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd just like to make a small contribution to this debate. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the All-Party Group on their report. I have to acknowledge a certain sense of guilt, as I should really be a fully paid-up member of the All-Party Group, and I'll try and rectify that afterwards. I fully support the broad aims and many of the ambitions and recommendations which are set out in the report. It's good to see cycling being debated and very much on the agenda. Cycling, as has already been said, has many virtues: health, social, it's sustainable, environmentally friendly, it has many economic benefits, it's a wonderful social activity, and quite simply it's also an effective means of transport. And it's encouraging to see the government taking a greater interest in cycling, encouraging to see them put it on as involved in the debate, and also seeing them putting some funding into cycling as well. However,
just to support what the honourable gentleman is saying, the government has actually put funds into putting a cycling bridge over the River Thames in my constituency in Reading East. And the big problem we have in Reading is that the local authority doesn't join up the cycle networks in Reading and just thinks that putting white paint on the road is enough to create safe cycleways, and I don't think that's good enough.
Quite right. And indeed, we should remember it's not just about central government, it's not just about funding coming from the centre, and it's not always looking to national government to take the lead. Local government, as my honourable friend has highlighted, has a critical role to play. How they encourage or discourage cyclists is important, what resources they are willing to give to cycling, and indeed local government can provide the innovation and leadership in their own communities to improve the opportunities for cycling.
My honourable friend give well that point?
Yes, certainly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving well. Would he support the massive transformation that's happened in my constituency of North West Leicestershire? We've got redundant coal mines now transformed into part of the new national forest and crisscrossed by numerous well-used and attractive cycle paths, and in particular the Hicks Lodge National Forest Cycle Centre, which allows thousands of families each year to have traffic-free cycling.
Good to see that these things are happening, and it does demonstrate there is a role for both national and local government improving cycling. I would describe myself as an irregular but enthusiastic cyclist with a tendency to go for the long cycles rather than the daily commute. Prior to the general election in 2010, I made a pledge to my local constituency that if I were elected, I would cycle from my constituency to London. And after being elected, the very first question I got from a reporter was, "And when do you intend to cycle to London?" Indeed, I did finally do that cycle, and this year I took a further, longer trip and went from Land's End to John O'Groats. And indeed, on both of those trips, the experience has been very good. Got a little bit fitter, lost a little bit of weight. It's a great social activity, doing it with friends. It's actually a great way to see your own country and the diversity of it, and indeed raise a little bit of money for charity along the way. But I'd make two serious observations from both of those cycle trips. There are potholes absolutely everywhere, and it would be very helpful if local government could do their best to try and rectify that, because it does make it very difficult as a cyclist. And secondly, I have very mixed views on fellow drivers when you're cycling along, and I'll come to that. I appreciate many members are going to be speaking about the report, their views and recommendations within it, but I just want to make two specific observations and suggestions, both of which I suspect will be highly controversial. Firstly, cyclists must take responsibility for their own safety. We must ride our bikes sensibly and appropriately. It is absolutely vital that cyclists respect other road users, especially cars, lorries, as well as pedestrians and other cyclists. But I also believe we should be wearing a helmet. And the last point, I would go further. There's a lot of campaigning that children should have to wear helmets compulsorily. I actually believe that that should be extended to everyone. Everyone that uses a bike should in fact use a helmet. I actually think if adults are seen to wear a helmet, it always encourages children to do so, but I actually see no reason why, in the interest of safety, that it shouldn't now be made compulsory. I appreciate there are counter-arguments to that. I appreciate there is a view that it would actually reduce the number of people who would take up cycling. I'm of the view that safety is important. I think gradually that would be overcome. In time, people will get used to the idea that you wear a helmet if you cycle. We've all got used to wearing safety belts. We've all got used to people wearing helmets when they go with motorbikes. Give way to the honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Would he also agree that it would be a good idea to encourage training in schools for children about cycle riding and how best to be safe on the roads? Because even if they were to go on not to cycle themselves and to drive cars, it would teach them about the danger of cycling unsatisfactorily or dangerously while they're driving their cars. So would he encourage the teaching of cycling properly in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely concur with that. My second point, which I think will also be equally as controversial, is I'm not convinced by the arguments regarding speed limits, enforcement or the education of drivers. Yes, that is a laudable aim, but I question whether the reality is that enough drivers will pay attention to speed limits, etc., to make cycling a much, much safer occupation and leisure activity. I fully accept many drivers are responsible and take care when there are cyclists around. They drive appropriately and safely, keeping their distance, slowing down, giving cyclists a wide berth. And indeed, during my cycles, there were many, many car drivers who did exactly that, took their time, were patient. But equally, there are a large number of drivers who actually think cyclists are a nuisance on the road, that they drive too close, they drive too fast, they actually endanger cyclists. And from my experiences, that is far more common than we would like to think. Therefore, I believe that there needs to be a slight, simple change in the law. In the event of an accident, there should be a presumption in favour of the cyclist over the driver. Clearly, any driver of a car has a right to rebut such a claim, and clearly we have to accept that there are irresponsible cyclists who take inappropriate care and attention when they cycle. However, I believe that such a change in the law would mean that car drivers, lorry drivers, motorists would take far, far greater care and make every effort to keep their distance from a cyclist. All of a sudden, cyclists would become something that they have to be very, very careful of, very, very wary of, because it could affect their insurance claim and indeed potentially criminality. This presumption is in fact accepted in some European countries. I see no reason why it could not be introduced in this country. If we want to reduce the number of accidents, we need to alter the approach that many drivers have to cyclists. We have to get to the stage where actually cycling is seen as something that is safe. The only way I believe to do that is to make cars and drivers far, far more aware of the dangers of hitting or affecting or coming into contact with cyclists. If we want to make cycling safe and therefore encourage others to start cycling, we have to change the relationship between the driver and the cyclist. I believe with these two simple changes of the law, we could effectively do that, and it would encourage cyclists in the future to cycle safely by wearing a helmet, but secondly to have the confidence that drivers are going to be taking far, far more care of them when they pass them on the road. I congratulate the All-Party Group once more on their report, and it would be interesting to see if they'll take up these two ideas that I've set out today. Thank you.
Simon Danchuk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me say that I'm pleased to follow the honourable member for Exeter. Let me also thank the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling Group for this excellent report and for securing this particular debate. The reason I speak in this particular debate is not just because I've had a lot of constituents urging me to take part in it. It's also because I believe I bring a particular perspective to the debate. I am a recent convert to cycling, and honourable friends on this side were advising me that the honourable member for Totnes might actually have had to inform me in advance that she was going to describe me in the chamber, middle-aged, overweight, desperately attempting to get back in shape, which is one of the reasons why I took up cycling. As the report says, Britain needs to relearn how to cycle, and that's exactly what I've been doing. And the reason I did that is because I'd been cycling in Holland on holiday. So for the last 5 years I've been holidaying in Holland and learnt much more about cycling for leisure purposes along with the family, and that's encouraged me to do it. But I do make the important point that before I started cycling again, I did share that view. I have to admit that I shared that view that many people hold, that disregard for cyclists. A wholly inappropriate view for cyclists, but I admit to having that view, and the report makes it quite clear that we need to change attitudes towards cyclists, and I'm one of those people that would have been guilty of that before I started cycling again. I won't, in terms of cycling in Holland, I won't rehearse all the arguments around why it's beneficial to cycle in Holland, the issue around segregation, the point about prioritisation for cyclists and the rest of it. But they're very important points. And it also relates to an important point that the Honourable Member for Dudley North made, which is around the fact that obviously in Holland many more cyclists are also drivers, many more drivers are also cyclists, so they give much more priority to cyclists than themselves. I will indeed.
To be honest, because I do agree with him about Holland. I have holidayed there many times, and obviously local councils are very much aware of ensuring that new schemes are cycle-friendly. Is he aware that in some areas, including mine, a community infrastructure funding scheme resulted in what was a very safe cycling route to a school was actually converted into a dedicated bus route, and there was no alternative cycle route put in place. So would you agree with me that when these community infrastructure funding schemes are put in place, there should be alternative, like-for-like, cycle-friendly arrangements made?
It's an excellent point, and it leads on to the point that I wish to make, which is that I've been cycling in the United Kingdom, primarily in Rochdale, for just 6 months now, and there are lots of good examples in terms of cycling. The Rochdale Canal has a great cycling path, but even that you can see that is falling into disrepair. So the work's been done some years ago and needs redoing. Kingsway Business Park in Rochdale, a new development, caters very well for cyclists because it's a new development, but not all new schemes have that designed into them, and I think the makes an important point in the need to do that. I will certainly give that.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I think he's making a very powerful case of something I've seen that's made a real difference in my local community, where our Waltham Forest cycling campaign and the local leadership from Councillor Clyde Lokes on my council has led to that insight of cyclists into what makes for a good system. So they've been feeding into how the council then develops issues. Does he think that that partnership between local community cycling groups and councils is something we should be learning from at a national level as well?
I think that's exactly right, and it's the point that was made by the Honourable Member for Exeter just before I spoke, which is that local authorities, in consultation with cyclists, that's who we need to speak to, and other road users, about how we can design better road layout, better systems for cyclists in our towns and cities, is absolutely crucial. And there's still a long way to go, certainly in places like Rochdale, there is no doubt about that. But let me turn to the final point that I wanted to make, and unlike the Honourable Member for Winchester, I do hold local councillors in very high esteem and have good things to say about them. And there's been much talk both in the report and in the Chamber about political leadership. And the need for political leadership around cycling. I think that is exactly right. And I want to put on record something that I've never put on record before. I have to say that it's a Liberal Democrat councillor in Rochdale who has done an excellent job in championing in supporting cycling. I won't withdraw that remark. They've done an excellent job. Councillor Vera Hobhouse really pushed the boundaries in terms of getting the local authority to do more in terms of cycling in Rochdale. That's been a real credit to her. She's still a councillor, but not now in a position of power. But we do need those local champions as well as national champions, people to provide political leadership to ensure that cycling gets a fair shout at a local level. So in conclusion, I pay credit to the APPG on cycling, and I strongly support the campaign that they've initiated. Thank you.
Mark Pawsey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the objectives of today's debate is to increase the proportion of journeys that are made by bike and getting people to use their bike more regularly, and that, Madam Deputy Speaker, makes me part of the target market. Unlike my honourable friend, the member for Carlisle, I'm not a regular cyclist. I describe myself as a fair weather cyclist and generally cycle infrequently for exercise or enjoyment on country lanes. But if we are to... Happily give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend. I am going to dust off my old bike and get cycling.
Well done, Colonel.
And I make that announcement immediately. It will help me live 2 more years.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the debate has already had its objective. We have a new cyclist here on the benches. But if we are to realise the objectives set out in today's motion, it's important that people like myself are encouraged to ride their bikes more. And I found my inspiration to use my bicycle came during the recess, when on Thursday of a couple of weeks ago I was reading the Times and I read an article by Dame Kelly Holmes encouraging us as members to ride our bikes before participating in today's debate. Now, I was intending to drive the 6 miles or so from my home to the constituency office, but on that particular day I decided to cycle. I have to say that the fact that the weather was very good during August and great sunshine made my decision a great deal easier. But I have a number of observations from that particular experience, and one of the first ones was driving in the cycle lane, travelling down Dunchurch Road in Rugby. I noticed other cyclists were still on the road. Now, why are these guys still on the road when I'm going down the cycle lane, which is half on the footpath? And then I realised that there were give-way lines on the side roads each time cars were coming out of the side roads, and I was having to give way to cars coming out onto the main road. Had I been on the road, I wouldn't have had that problem, and therefore those other cyclists were making much faster progress than I was. And perhaps the Minister might deal with that issue when he comes to sum up at the end of the day. Why does the car coming out of a side road have priority over the cyclist on a cycleway? Happily give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and would he also agree that this might be an area where local authorities could be given more discretion to depart from national guidance and work out imaginative solutions that work in their own areas?
I thank the honourable lady for her intervention, and I certainly would like to see it made easier or greater encouragement given for cyclists to use cycleways when they're provided. The second problem I had was I had got some constituency duties that particular day. It was a warm day. I realised that I perhaps ought to carry an additional shirt with me, so I put that in a rucksack on my back. And I still arrived soaking in sweat and didn't look very much like an MP. I tweeted about that, and I received some very useful advice on Twitter, which was to put some panniers on my bike so that at least I didn't have to stick the rucksack on my back and get my back wet. So if I'm going to use my bike regularly, I need to invest in some panniers. I also found that in many instances the cycleway was in pretty poor condition with very unclear markings. There's a cycleway that was probably made 3 or 4 years ago, and local authorities therefore need to invest in the markings on cycleways. And on more than one occasion I found trees overgrown all over the cycleway, forcing me out onto the road, and the cycleway was of no use at all. We've also heard 1 or 2 members talking about vehicles parked in the cycleway, and on more than one occasion I was forced from the cycleway into the road because of an illegally parked car or van. And I share the concerns that members have raised about some flexibility to car users causing difficulty to cyclists. I took my life in my hands at a slip road on a dual carriageway where there was fast traffic going to the right of me, and then as I progressed along the slip road to the left of me, coming up my inside. Fortunately, it was a quiet day, but I would hate to have been on that particular road, and there needs to be some provision for cyclists on slipways off dual carriageways. And I also felt very uncomfortable on roundabouts, and I know that roundabouts have been a particular area of concern for the all-party group. And I hope that through this debate we get better design of road schemes to allow for cyclists. I was interested to hear, I've only taken 2 interventions, so I'll continue if I may. We've heard some discussion about the mandate, about the use of helmets, and for me a decision about whether or not to use a helmet was made when I came to hire a bike in the Lake District. And I said to the assistant serving me that I'd be more than happy not to bother with a helmet, to which this young gentleman looked at me and said, "Sir, how many brains have you got?" Now, I know there's a member in the House who runs by the nickname of Two Brains, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, that isn't me. And I found the case that the sales assistant was making to me to take the cycle helmet very persuasive. But I think to make progress with the aims of this debate, the target should not be the journey that I made of 6 miles or so. It really should be those making journeys of up to 3 miles in urban areas. In a town such as I represent in Rugby, it's far too easy, and in fact the natural assumption for people to make a journey from one of the suburbs, Hillmorton or Bilton, into the town centre, a journey of no more than a couple of miles. It's far too easy for people to instinctively get into their cars, and I think those are the people who this campaign needs to target. We've already heard about the health and cost benefits that accrue to individuals who make such a decision, and the benefits to the environment if more people do so more generally. We heard some comment about planning, and the planning aspects do need to be linked up. I know in my constituency, in the Rugby Borough Council, have had a green travel plan, and only during recess I went out to visit a business who had built a recent development site, and they, as part of the green travel plan, had been forced to put in a cycle shed, and regrettably, Madam Deputy Speaker, there wasn't a single bike in it. So the policies do need to be joined up. But we do have some absolutely fantastic cycleways in my constituency, and only last Thursday in the constituency, the official reopening by the Mayor took place of a 173-year-old railway viaduct that had been derelict 60 years ago. Trains last travelled on this route. It was opened as a new cycleway by Sustrans using a grant from the Big Lottery Fund, and this viaduct acts as a cycleway linking northern areas of the town to the train centre and train station and town centre, and it's a fantastic initiative which supports Rugby's regeneration strategy, and I'm sure that it'll see many more cyclists used in Rugby. We've already also heard Madam Deputy Speaker about cyclists sharing their road space with other users, and particularly the problems created by HGVs. And I did hear somebody say, can we do something about HGVs? And I think that the impact of HGVs on cyclists is something that is taken very seriously by the logistics industry in the country. And I would draw members' attention to a company called Cemex in my constituency, who ship cement around the country, who certainly at the Conservative Party conference last year, and I'm hoping they were at other conferences as well, took one of their vehicles and parked it and allowed people to get into the cab so that a cyclist could see exactly the blind spot that the lorry driver suffers from when he's driving. And I hope that more and more logistics companies will do precisely that. There's another company who did that at a fete I attended. I thank the all-party group for bringing this debate forward, and I look forward to progress on cycling over the years to come.
David Lanning.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also congratulate the Honourable Member for Cambridge and my right honourable friend, the Member for Dudley North, on all their work on the all-party group, but also Adam Kaufman, who is my constituent, for all he's done to raise the issue of cycling in our national life. And I know that in debates like this, it's easy to get a sense that people are playing lip service to the subject of cycling, but the profound and cultural change that we need in this country has not yet arrived and now has to arrive. And I think it's important that we recognise that certainly here in London, this debate about cycling is being had against the backdrop of people having to really wrestle with issues of not just quality of life, but the cost of living. Petrol prices, transport costs, rises in bus fares and tube fares, but I know transport costs beyond London mean that people really want cycling to be a serious option. And for a lot of the reasons that honourable members have raised, and some that I will touch on, it doesn't feel like a realistic option. And it's the vision behind this report that I think members want to see the government get behind to make that happen. So we need long-term commitments and aims, not simply the short-term initiatives and the headline-grabbing initiatives that we've had in the past. The target of a 10% modal share for cycling by 2025 is a good one, but it's not going to happen by itself. Frankly, it's shocking that just 6% of people in Britain cycle for more than 30 minutes once a week, and only 2% use a bike to get to work. I might say that this has been said before, but in 2010, honourable members will remember that the Labour Party lost the election. Very sadly. And it's been said about ministers that you know you're not a minister any longer when you get into the back of the car and it doesn't start. And I certainly found myself in that situation, but I also have to say, at that point, at the age of 30 whatever, I was not a driver. And so, when I hit 40, I decided I would learn to drive. And I could be found driving up Barnet High Road, trying to learn to drive. And on my third attempt, very recently, I got my driving licence. But I hate driving and have not really been back in a car since. What I like doing is cycling. And I, too, took my family to Holland this summer on a cycling holiday of 10 days. And I have to say, I took a 5- and a 7-year-old on we did about 80 kilometres over 10 days. That is something I don't think I could do in this country. I certainly don't think I could do it easily in London because I simply would not feel secure enough about the safety of a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old on their bikes on the cycleways. And I think that parents up and down the country want this report to be taken seriously because they do want to see their children cycling. And I might say, and no one else has touched on this, I am concerned that the cycling proficiency that many honourable members will recall when they were younger seems to be very patchy across the country, school to school, local authority to local authority. Yes, we've raised this debate about helmets, but we also have to invest in proper cycling proficiency if we want to see cycling increase amongst young people. I will go on.
Gentlemen, accept from me that one superb way of commencing on the cycling pathway is to have an electric bicycle, which I have an example of, and is a wonderful way of commencing cycling and getting people interested in it. I don't think it's received much attention, this debate till now, but I urge him to plug the advantages and merits of electric bikes.
I think the honourable member makes a very good point, and actually I knew nothing about electric bikes until I saw some actually in Holland just a few days ago, and thought maybe I should get one. But as I'm, wanting to get rid of this girth, I decided against it. I will.
He's been very generous, and if I could take the honourable gentleman back to his point about cycling proficiency, I wonder if another point of transition for introducing cycling proficiency would be when young people go to university and often they get back onto bikes, having not been on them since they were young children, and this can lead to some very dangerous situations and often road deaths.
Well, the honourable lady makes a very good point. They're getting onto bikes again because of cost-saving issues, but they're getting off onto bikes in towns and cities where, frankly, the prioritisation that we need around cycles are not there, and some of the serious resulting deaths and injuries is something that should be of great concern. Nearly half of all car journeys in London are less than 2 miles, and that is an easily bikeable distance. So we have to ask the question why so many people aren't choosing to bike. And as the Honourable Lady indicated, in London alone, over 500 cyclists were seriously injured in just 1 year, and that's up 22% on the previous year. Now, it's right that the current mayor has done much to encourage cycling in London, and he should be congratulated for getting behind cycling, and I think his appointment of a cycling czar has also been very important. But targets for reducing cycle casualties have been consistently missed. And in fact, cycling casualties in London have increased every year since 2008, a figure that is only partly explained, I think, by participation rates in cycling. At a national level, 122 cyclists were killed on British roads last year. So road accidents are still proportionately involving cycling, despite the incidence of other road accidents falling. This is an issue that I think has to be addressed. And frankly, it can only be addressed if we, yes, challenge the culture of cycling, but also don't just have a transport policy that can feel sometimes like a motorist policy, but actually a policy that is prepared to put both pedestrians and cyclists alongside motorists. And there, some of the remarks have been made about the share of investment in cycling in this debate really need to be taken seriously if we're going to get the shift that the Minister has said he wants, and I suspect will say he wants in closing, but feels a long way off for those of us who want to see cycling get up to where it needs to be. So yes, investment and participation campaigns are crucial, but they'll only go so far. Ministers must treat British roads as existing not just for cars, but also for cyclists. There also needs to be a much greater priority, it seems to me, on safety, and that means proper investment in cycling paths, borough to borough, road to road, and new radical solutions, I think, that promote that cycling. I welcome this debate. It's really only the very beginning of this subject. I hope the House will return to it, but I hope we'll see the step change that we need in this country over the coming months.
Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak after the Honourable Member for Tottenham. I applaud this debate and I applaud this report. I think it's an absolutely outstanding report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and I applaud the Honourable Member, my friend from Cambridge, and also Dudley North. A number of colleagues who have been here much longer than me mention how well attended the debate is, and since then around about 15 or 20 honourable members have actually left the chamber and will be back later. Despite that, seeing the numbers of people who are still in the chamber, I would very strongly guess that compared to only 5 years ago, I think it would probably be double, and 10 years ago, triple. And that shows the enormous strides that have really got underneath the whole cycling debate over the last few years, which I'm very, very supportive of, for a number of key reasons. One of them is business case. In Eastbourne, we've got a very, very strong cycling group called Bespoke, who are tremendously enthused and involved with driving the cycling agenda within Eastbourne, which I'm very supportive of. And one of the reasons is the business case. Eastbourne's a wonderful town, it's a seaside town. We've bucked the economic trend over the last few years with unemployment going down, apprenticeships going up, regeneration within the town centre, of a £70 million private spend. But one of the areas I'm very keen on driving the agenda using cycling is, like a lot of the other parts of the UK and the coastline, but in Eastbourne it is a lovely town for a cycling holiday. The Honourable Member for Tottenham mentioned that he went with his family over to Holland, which I did myself only a few months ago, and the honourable member is quite right. The level of cycling there and the safety is astounding, because obviously it's been part of the culture for 40 years. And we are catching up, and I appreciate that. But with a town like Eastbourne, I'm absolutely convinced that as we drive the cycling agenda and get more and more families and tourists within to the town, as we improve the cycle paths, it will make a substantial difference to the actual economic turnover of the town. Nationally, you're looking at a gross cycling product of around 2.9 billion, 3.7 million bikes sold in the UK. That's a 28% increase from last year. There are 23,000 people employed directly in cycling today within the UK. It is an absolutely major and substantial benefit to the United Kingdom PLC, but also I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. And today, with the numbers of people within the House, as demonstrated by this report, the whole cycling agenda across a whole range of areas, from health, business and carbon emissions, clearly I think the UK is going in the right direction. It's got a way to go, but I do believe, if you excuse the pun, the starting gun has started. For myself, I have to tell you, I haven't ridden a bike for 40 years, and then Bespoke persuaded me to get on the bicycle for what they said was a short ride about 4 weeks ago, 2.5 hours later. I think the Honourable Member for Totnes says that cycling takes 10 years off your life. After not having ridden a bike for 40 years and riding it for 2.5 years, I could tell her that it certainly took 10 years off my life. And I could barely stand actually afterwards. But the good news for Honourable Members who, like me, haven't cycled for a long, long time is it really is like riding a bike. I got on straight away, a few wobbles and was away. But what are the challenges? We know the challenges. The Honourable Member for Exeter made a strong point, and I think a valid point, that the previous government had invested a lot of time and money within cycling, and I think they deserve a lot of the credit for really pushing the agenda. I think the difference is obviously my own government. We've inherited a real economic crisis, which means challenging decisions have to be taken. But I would urge and encourage the coalition to really focus on this report. There's a lot of very good recommendations. It doesn't cost a lot of money. I'm very confident that if proper investment was put behind it and following the recommendations that the APPG had put together, we really would, A, get an economic benefit out of it, really quite substantial, but equally, I think it would help transform the lives of a lot of people in the UK who perhaps, like myself, shouldn't wait 40 years to get back on a bike. Because the challenges are there. And we're back to the Holland versus UK. There is a different infrastructure there. This is an old country. It hasn't been designed for cycles, so I do appreciate the challenges that any government actually faces to transform it. I know my honourable friend, the Minister for Transport, who has responsibility for this, from Lewis, is a neighbour of mine. I know he's been passionate about cycling and bikes for as long as I've known him, which is 11 years, and I know that there is no stronger champion in the government. But one of the things that I would look forward to hearing from him when he sums up afterwards is exactly what further initiatives the government are going to do to keep this moving in the right direction, to build on the momentum that we've had over the last 15 years, but to really take off. Because I think, looking at the size of the numbers of people in the debate for a backbench businesses debate, frankly, more people than I've ever seen, it demonstrates the strength of, not just the strength of feeling in the country, but the opportunity, the time has come. Political leadership. I look forward to hearing from the government in the response later.
Chiamwara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I'd like to start by welcoming the All Parties report and this debate. It is good to see such cross-party agreement on what is such a positive issue, and I hope when the Minister rises to respond, he will give us the assurances we are all looking for. So far, ministers and the department have been full of warm words of support and like to give the impression that this country is freewheeling towards becoming a cycling nation on a par with, say, Holland. But I'm afraid that we are not even ambling in that direction, and that we need sustained action and leadership from ministers, if we want to achieve this in a reasonable time frame. Many honourable members have spoken of the benefits of cycling to individuals, to children, to society, to cities, to the environment. At the end of July, Newcastle Gateshead hosted its first Sky Ride. It was an amazing success with 7,800 people attending, and shows just how many people in Newcastle and Gateshead want to get on their bikes if they can feel safe about doing so. Because despite that, the North East has some of the lowest levels of cycling in the UK, with just 8% of people currently cycling once a week. We also, and it is perhaps related, have higher than average levels of obesity and lower levels of physical activity in adults. So I want to pay tribute to the work that Newcastle City Council is doing and their commitment to supporting cycling. We're lucky in Newcastle to have cross-party, strong political leadership for cycling. We have an enthusiastic cycling champion, Councillor Marion Talbot, who chairs our cycling forum, bringing together the many different voices for cycling in our city. There is, however, a clear lack of such strong political leadership at the national level. The abolition of Cycling England, set up under the last Labour government, means that there's now no dedicated pot of money and, equally importantly, no focal point for cycling. What we have is ad hoc announcements and re-announcements, and then repackaged re-announcements. Releasing separate pots of money seemingly at random for cycling and infrastructure makes it very difficult for local authorities like Newcastle to plan a cycling development. And with the abolition of Cycle England, there was no obvious means for councils to share ideas and some of the great best practice we've heard of today, other than the mysterious Cycle Stakeholder Forum, which has yet to be mentioned, but which has apparently met 3 times in the 3 years, in a moment, it has existed. But for what purpose, nobody seems to know. But perhaps the honourable member will enlighten us.
I'm most grateful for the honourable lady giving way. The honourable lady talks about Cycling England being abolished. And surely that's one of the best mechanisms for sharing best practice regarding cycling.
I thank him for that, the honourable member, for that contribution. But the Local Government Association has many issues on which to share best practice, and I agree it provides an excellent forum for that. The strength of Cycle England was exactly, it did what it said on the name. It was about cycling in England, and having lost that, we do need something to fulfil that role.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, who's making an excellent speech. Would she agree that the sorts of initiatives and sort of half policy that she's indicating is not what we see when the government comes to transport policy in relation to trains, buses, and in relation to cars and roads? So that's why we need a proper integrated strategy.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. Comparisons are odious, but in some cases they are essential. And I think we can all agree here in this chamber that there is not the focus or the strategy for cycling that we do see in some other areas of transport. And I hope when the Minister responds, he will set out how he intends to address this clear lack of leadership. Now, the report notes that successfully increasing cycling in many towns requires not just leadership and political will, but also investment. The report and colleagues today have noted the relative underfunding of British cycling per head. The Department for Transport response to the report was disappointing. The long-term funding issue wasn't addressed at all, and on most other issues, the book was passed to local authorities, and there was no commitment to appoint a national cycling champion. This is not the leadership we need. Newcastle was awarded £5.7 million from the Cycle City Ambition Fund, and I welcome this. And this is on top of the £1.3 million from the Cycle Safety Fund, but this is still relatively little compared to European cities. Now, it is, as has been mentioned a number of times, it is not just the level of funding that is important. Whatever the level of spending per head, investment from government must be continued, steady and sustained if councils such as Newcastle are to plan to achieve their goals with all the resulting benefits that we've heard of. Whilst much of the legwork in getting cycling does and should fall to councils, there is still plenty for the government to do to support them. Newcastle is working hard to make the city roads cycle-friendly, installing better cycling infrastructure. It is one of the leading local authorities on 20-mile-per-hour zones, with the majority of residential areas and much of the city centre now at 20 miles per hour. In the department's response to this report, they rightly said that planning, cycle routes, speed limits and so forth are local issues. But what about putting in place national standards for cycle infrastructure design, or educating more people with the skills to design it? What about reviewing sentence guidelines for careless and reckless drivers? Investment is important. A long-term pot is almost as important as the amount that goes into it. But above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, ministers in the Department for Transport and their colleagues across Whitehall must step up and show some national leadership if we are to meet the goals set out in the report.
Order. I still have 19 speakers who wish to participate in today's debate, so I'm going to reduce the time limit to 5 minutes from the next speaker in the hope that we will be able to get everybody in. Can I ask that, by all means, of course, interventions help the debate, but particularly if the member's already spoken, perhaps they'll bear in mind there are others still waiting to speak. So it's 5 minutes now, and it's Mr. Graham Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to speak in this very important issue. As a fairly recent convert to cycling, I have personal experience of the many benefits, while also conscious of the dangers, especially of those who are those new to the sport, such as myself. The Evans household has become an enthusiastic cycling family with new bikes for the children and not so new bikes for mum and dad. And interestingly, hearing the debate about helmets, I insist that we all wear helmets, and for some reason when I put my helmet on, the children point and laugh. I don't know, I have no idea why. In my constituency, there is a fantastic grassroots movement encouraging residents to get on their bikes. I would like to credit the Northwich Guardian's Pedal Power campaign for really drawing attention to my constituents the importance of cycling. Their profiles of cycling ambassadors, who range from teenage pro-bikers to blind nonagarians, are showing my constituents that a bike is for everyone at any stage of their lives. I welcome the Get Britain Cycling report produced by the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling Group and their target of 1 in 10 journeys to be made by bike by 2025. Road safety is also an issue of great importance to me, as I am presenting my private member's bill on drug driving compulsory assessment to the House on the 18th of October for its second reading. The benefits to cycling are clear. Better health is the obvious starting point. A regular cyclist in his mid-adulthood has the fitness levels of someone 10 years younger, and I think we've already had many comments about us all wanting to be 10 years younger. When we look at Britain's transport systems, it is clear that there must be a better way. Most of us find ourselves sitting in long traffic jams on that quick run down the road to the shops to pick up some milk and a loaf of bread. In fact, 66% of all trips made in Britain are less than 5 miles. When you factor in getting to where you need to go before hunting down a parking space, it seems daft that you could reasonably often nip down on your bike to the shops. And then there are the economic arguments. Regular cyclists have lower health costs, while the cost of congestion on the economy goes down and productivity goes up. So what is stopping people cycling? The main reason is safety.